Martin Cole farmed 1,800 acres in Lancaster County, Nebraska. He had the most advanced precision agriculture system in the county. $8,000 of soil analysis. He told Harold Finch, in front of witnesses, that Harold's $15 soil test would get him almost nothing. 3 years later, Harold Finch's worst fields were producing 168 bushels per acre. And Martin Cole was sitting alone at his kitchen table doing the math on what his $8,000 analysis had missed. The number he arrived at was $340,000. He picked up the phone and called Harold Finch. What he said next is the part of the story most people don't expect. Soil does not forget what has been done to it. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological and chemical fact that agronomists have been documenting for 100 years and that farmers in the older traditions have understood for far longer, understood not in the language of cation exchange capacity and pH buffering systems but in the language of observation, of cause and effect spread across seasons and decades, of the slow and patient reading of what the earth produces and what it refuses to produce. When you pour something onto a field, lime, fertilizer, herbicide, the field absorbs it and holds it and changes in response to it, and the change persists. Not forever. But far longer than the season in which it was applied. The soil is a system with memory, and like all systems with memory it is possible to spend years correcting for something you did not know you had done. Harold Finch had been farming 480 acres of bottomland and upland in Lancaster County, Nebraska for 31 years, and for all 30 of those years he had been applying agricultural lime at the rate the Extension Service recommended and that he had never had particular reason to question. He had good reason now. His yields had been dropping for 3 years, not catastrophically, not in the way that makes the news or triggers emergency calls to the bank, but steadily and specifically, in a pattern that had the quality of something systematic rather than something random. A soil test that cost $15 told him what the problem was. What he did with that information, and who had been telling him the test was unnecessary, is the story of how one specific number changed the way farming was talked about in Lancaster County for the next decade. Harold Finch drove his fields in the first week of April the way he drove them every spring, slowly, in the old pickup, stopping every quarter mile to get out and look at the soil and at the early season growth. He had been doing this for 31 years and his eye for the land was good in the way that an eye developed over decades of paying attention to one specific place becomes good, not just for the obvious things but for the subtle ones. He was 61 years old, lean and deliberate, with a face that showed 31 Nebraska winters and summers in the way outdoor faces do, not aged exactly but weathered, the lines going where the weather had put them. He wore work pants, flannel shirt, a canvas jacket with the name of an implement dealer on the chest that had been out of business since 1994. His yields had been declining for 3 years. He had noticed it first in the fall of 2000, when his corn yields came in at 142 bushels per acre, down from the 161 he had averaged over the previous 5 years. He had attributed it to weather. 2000 had been a difficult summer, dry in July when the corn needed water. But 2001 had been a normal year and the yields came in at 147, still below the 5-year average. 2002 had been another dry summer and the yields fell to 138. 3 years, 3 below average results, in a pattern that weather alone did not explain. He drove his fields in April 2003 and what he saw was inconsistent with anything he understood about the cause. The growth was uneven, not uniformly poor but variable in a way that suggested a systematic cause rather than weather. The low-lying areas performed about as expected. But some of the well-drained upland areas, the ground that should have been his most productive, were showing a pale green he associated with nutrient limitation, and others geographically similar were showing normal growth. He drove home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with his yield maps from the past 3 years and looked at them for a long time. He thought about soil chemistry. He thought about pH. He had been liming his fields for 30 years. He called the Lancaster County Extension office the next morning and asked about soil testing. Martin Cole was not the person Harold called about soil testing. He was the person Harold heard from at the agricultural supply store in Waverly the following week, when Harold went in for seed treatment supplies and Martin Cole was there buying herbicide and heard from Dale Richter, the man behind the counter, who had been behind the counter since 1981 and knew everyone's business, that Harold Finch was looking at getting his soil tested. Martin Cole was 55 years old and farmed 1,800 acres in the north part of Lancaster County and was, by the common assessment of the farming community around Waverly, the most successful operation in the area. He had the specific confidence of a man whose success had been visible and sustained. He drove a new pickup every 3 years, had upgraded to a full precision agriculture package in 2001, and had been one of the early adopters of variable rate application technology in the county. He was also a man who had opinions about how farming should be done, and who shared those opinions with the conviction of someone whose track record entitled him to share them. "Harold," he said, leaning against the counter in the way of a man who has time to talk. "Dale says you're thinking about getting a soil test." "That's right," Harold said. "Thinking about the basic county lab test?" "I've been looking into it," Harold said. Martin Cole shook his head with the expression of someone exercising patience about something obvious. "Harold, a basic pH test from the county lab is like checking the oil pressure on a tractor without looking at anything else. It tells you one number. It doesn't tell you what's going on." "I'm specifically interested in one number," Harold said. "What you want is a precision grid analysis," Martin said. "I had the full package done on my operation 2 years ago. 2.5 acre grid, comprehensive nutrient panel, variable rate prescriptions. Cost me about $8,000 for the whole farm. Best money I've ever spent." $8,000, Harold said. "Best money I've ever spent," Martin repeated. "My yields went up 11% in the first year." 11%.
Global chip shortage
You want to
hits
know what
the
a $15
agricultural
soil
sector.
test gets you? It gets you one piece of information about a system that has 20 variables. Harold looked at him. "My operation is 480 acres, he said. "Not 800. The principle is the same." "The economics might not be," Harold said. Martin Cole looked at him with the patient skepticism of a man who believes the other person is missing something obvious. "Harold, you've been having yield problems for 3 years. You need real information to fix real problems. That $15 test is going to tell you almost nothing." Harold thanked him for his time and paid for his seed treatment supplies and drove home. He thought about what Martin Cole had said on the drive home. Martin Cole was not unintelligent, and his precision agriculture package had genuinely worked for him, and the 11% yield increase he cited was probably real. The question was whether the logic of Martin's 800 acre precision operation with full variable rate equipment translated to Harold's situation. Harold had a specific question. He wanted to know whether 30 years of lime applications at the extension recommended rate had elevated his soil pH above the optimal range on the lighter upland soils. That question was not the same as the question Martin Cole's comprehensive analysis was designed to answer. Eleanor Finch had been Harold's wife for 33 years and had opinions about most things and expressed them. She was 58 years old and had grown up on a farm in Custer County, the daughter of a man who had farmed with the careful intelligence of someone who had lived through the 1950s drought and had drawn from it the lesson that what you didn't know about your land could cost you as surely as what you did know. Her father had soil tested every field every 3 years, at a time when soil testing was considered by some of his neighbors to be a somewhat academic exercise, and the returns on his operation had been consistently above the county average. Eleanor had absorbed this orientation without being taught it directly, the way children absorb the orientations of people they respect. She had heard about the conversation with Martin Cole from Harold that evening. "He told you what you need is $8,000 of analysis," she said. "He told me the $15 test is almost nothing," Harold said. "That depends on what question you're asking," Eleanor said. "That's what I thought," Harold said. "The county lab does basic pH testing," Eleanor said. "I read about it in the extension newsletter last year. You take the samples yourself, drop them off, they mail you the results in 3 weeks. How much? $15 per sample in the newsletter. You decide how many samples to take." Eleanor went to the filing cabinet. She kept 3 years of extension newsletters organized by date, and found the one she was thinking of and brought it to the kitchen table. The newsletter described a basic soil pH and organic matter testing service from the University of Nebraska Soil Testing Laboratory at exactly $15 per sample. The service did not include the comprehensive nutrient analysis of a precision grid program, but it included pH and buffer pH, the two measurements that would tell Harold whether 30 years of lime applications had moved his soil's pH outside the optimal range. "How many samples?" Harold asked. "How many distinct areas do you want to test?" Eleanor said. Harold thought about his fields, about the variation he had observed in the spring growth, about the specific positions of the underperforming areas. He counted the distinct zones he wanted information about. 14, he said. 14 samples at $15 each was $210. Harold drove out the following morning with a soil probe borrowed from his neighbor's equipment shed and spent 4 hours collecting samples from 14 locations across his 480 acres. He put the samples in labeled plastic bags, drove them to the extension office in Lincoln, paid $210 at the counter, and drove home. He waited 3 weeks. In the meantime, he ran into Martin Cole twice, once at the elevator and once at the equipment dealer, and both times Martin asked him what he had decided about the soil testing, and both times Harold said he was waiting on results, and both times Martin nodded in the way of a man who has made up his mind about the answer before hearing the question. Harold Finch had established his liming program in 1973, 1 year after buying the first 320 acres from the Gessler estate. He established it at the Extension Service recommendation, 2 tons per acre every 4 years, applied on a rotating schedule, to maintain soil pH in the range of 6.0 to 6.5. He had followed this recommendation conscientiously for 30 years. What he had not known when he established the program was that his soil's buffering capacity was not uniform across the farm. His bottomland soils, heavier, with higher clay and organic matter content, had the buffering capacity the recommendation assumed. His upland soils, lighter, sandier, with lower organic matter, had lower buffering capacity. The same rate of lime application appropriate for the bottomland was, over time, too high for the upland. He tested once, in 1986, when he bought the additional 160 acres. The test showed adequate pH across the farm. He took this as confirmation that the program was working and stopped testing. The 1986 test had been at 13 years into the program, still in the window where the overliming on the light soils had not yet pushed pH above optimal. He did not know this. He saw adequate pH and continued the program. By 2003, the upland soils had received 15 tons of lime per acre over 30 years. In the lighter upland soils, this had pushed pH above 7.5, above the optimal 6.0 to 6.5 range, into a zone where manganese and zinc become significantly less available to plants. Enough to reduce yields by 10 to 15%. Enough to produce, over 3 consecutive years, exactly the yield pattern Harold had been observing without understanding. He had tested the soil in 1986 and found no problem. He had continued applying lime for 17 more years without testing again, because the program had been confirmed once and he had not thought to question it. His father would have tested more often. His father had always said that a recommendation was a starting point, not a permanent instruction, that your ground was specific and the recommendations were general and you had to verify the match between them on a regular basis. Harold had known this, in the way you know things your father told you, without applying it. The results arrived on a Thursday in late May, in a plain envelope from the University of Nebraska Soil Testing Laboratory. Harold opened it at the kitchen table with Eleanor sitting across from him. A single sheet of paper with 14 rows of data, one for each sample location, identified by the code he had written on the sample bags. Each row showed the sample pH, the buffer pH, and the organic matter percentage. Harold looked at the numbers in silence for a long time. 9 of the 14 sample locations showed pH values above 7.0. 6 of those 9 showed values above 7.5. The locations with the highest pH values corresponded almost exactly, when Harold plotted them on his field map, with the areas of yield suppression he had been seeing in the spring growth. The bottomland samples showed pH values of 6.3 to 6.8. Normal. Expected. The upland samples showed pH values of 7.2 to 7.9. Too high. High enough to explain the yield suppression through micronutrient unavailability. There it is, Harold said. Eleanor looked at the sheet. 30 years, she said. 30 years, Harold agreed. He sat at the table and did the arithmetic. The lime applied to approximately 180 acres of upland ground at 2 tons per acre every 4 years for 30 years, roughly $94,500 in lime, of which he estimated perhaps $61,000 in the later years had been unnecessary and counterproductive. He had also been losing, conservatively, 10% of his yield on those 180 acres for what he estimated at least 15 years. At current corn prices and yield levels, 10% of the yield on 180 acres was approximately $15,000 per year. 15 years was $225,000, $286,000, approximately. 30 years of unnecessary lime and 15 years of suppressed yields. He had known none of this before the $15 test. Martin Cole had told him the $15 test would get him almost nothing. Harold did not call Martin Cole. He called the Extension Service. The Extension Service specialist Harold spoke with was named Harlan Webb, the regional soil scientist, 44 years old, PhD from Iowa State, 7 years in the county. When Harold described the results, Harlan was quiet for a moment. "You have an overliming problem," Harlan said. "Yes," Harold said. "The extension liming recommendation assumes a particular buffering capacity," Harlan said. "For soils with lower buffering capacity." The rate is too high, Harold said. I understand the mechanism. I want to know how to fix it. Harlan told him, stop liming the upland areas. Apply elemental sulfur to accelerate the acidification, 3 to 500 pounds per acre on the most affected areas. Test again in 2 years. How long to full recovery? Harold asked. 3 to 5 years for the pH to come back into range in light soils, Harlan said. The sulfur accelerates it. You should see measurable improvement in yields within 2 growing seasons. I called you first, back in April, Harold said. You recommended a $6,000 precision grid analysis. A pause. I recommended the most comprehensive diagnostic for the yield decline you described, Harlan said carefully. I asked specifically whether my liming history might be the problem, Harold said. A basic pH test answered that question for $210. You're right, Harlan Webb said. The basic test was the appropriate tool for the specific question you were asking. I should have helped you identify the question more precisely before recommending the analysis. A pause. I'm sorry I didn't. Harold accepted this. Now I need to fix it, he said. He applied sulfur to the upland areas in August 2003. He did not tell Martin Cole about the results. He did not tell anyone, except Eleanor and Harlan Webb. He went back to farming. The recovery was not dramatic. It was the kind of recovery that farming almost always is, slow, measured, visible only in aggregated data across seasons. Harold tested the upland areas in April 2004, pH down an average of 0.3 units from the August 2003 readings. Not back in range, but moving in the right direction. He planted. He waited. He harvested. The 2004 corn yields on the upland areas, 149 bushels per acre. Up 11 from the 138 of 2002. Not where he wanted to be, but measurably better. He tested in the spring of 2005, pH down another 0.4 units. Approaching the target range. He applied a second sulfur treatment to the most elevated areas. The 2005 yields on the upland areas, 157 bushels per acre. Within normal range for the first time in several years. Spring 2006, the pH on the treated areas tested at 6.4 to 6.9, fully within the optimal range. He had corrected the problem. Fall 2006, the corn yields on the upland areas came in at 168 bushels per acre. Better than the bottomland. Better than any year Harold had recorded on those specific fields. He sat at the kitchen table that November with the yield records and the field map and looked at the numbers. 168 bushels per acre on ground that had been yielding 138 4 years ago. The elevated pH had been suppressing yields that those soils, properly managed, were capable of producing. Now that the pH was correct, the yield potential was being realized. He thought about what Martin Cole had said in the supply store, that $15 test is going to tell you almost nothing. He thought about the 168 bushels per acre. He thought about the arithmetic Eleanor was going to do when he showed her these numbers. Eleanor Finch had been keeping the farm's financial records for 33 years, and she was precise about it, not in the sense of sophistication but in the sense of accuracy, of knowing what numbers meant and being willing to say what they meant. In December 2006, after the yield results were confirmed and Harold had verified that the overliming problem was corrected, she sat at the kitchen table with the farm records and did the full calculation. The lime applied to the upland areas over 30 years, she had the purchase records from 1975 forward and could reconstruct the first 3 years from the invoice files Harold had kept in the barn. Total purchase and application cost, approximately $91,400. Not all of that was unnecessary, some lime application in the early years had probably been appropriate. But she estimated that the lime applied in the last 20 years of the program, from approximately 1983, when the pH had likely entered the elevated range, was approximately $61,000 in lime that had not improved yields and had likely reduced them. The yield suppression, she worked backward from the 2003 pH readings and the rate at which the sulfur reduced the pH, and concluded that the pH had likely been above 7.0 on the upland areas for approximately 20 years, since the mid-1980s. She estimated the yield suppression at 8% over that period, conservative, given that the most affected areas had tested at 7.5 to 7.9. 8% of the upland yield on 180 acres over 20 years was approximately $198,000 at the weighted average corn and soybean prices over the period. Total cost of not testing regularly, approximately $259,000 over 30 years. The cost of the tests that would have prevented the problem, 14 tests every 5 years over 30 years was 6 testing cycles, at $210 per cycle, for a total of approximately $1.260 in soil testing. She looked at these numbers for a long time. Then she brought them to Harold in the machine shed. Harold looked at the calculation without saying anything for a while. Then he said, $259,000. Give or take, Eleanor said. The yield suppression estimate is conservative. And the tests would have cost $1,200, Harold said. Over 30 years. Yes, Eleanor said. Harold set down the wrench he had been holding and looked at the numbers again. I'm taking this to the association meeting in January, he said. I thought you might, Eleanor said. Martin Cole will be there, Harold said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. I know, she said. Martin Cole had heard, through the grain elevator conversation network that functioned in Lancaster County with the efficiency of a telegraph system, that Harold Finch's upland corn had come in at 168 bushels per acre in 2006. He had heard this in November, from Dale Richter at the supply store, the same place where, 3 years earlier, Martin had told Harold that a $15 soil test was almost nothing. Dale mentioned it in the offhand way he mentioned things, which was to say he mentioned it specifically because he knew Martin would find it interesting. Martin Cole was not a stupid man. He had made the connection between the 168 bushel yield and the soil testing conversation immediately. He had also done his own arithmetic. Roughly, Harold's upland areas had been yielding 138 in 2002 and were now yielding 168. 30 bushels an acre on what Martin estimated was 150 to 200 upland acres was $45,000 to $60,000 per year in additional revenue. For a 480-acre operation, that was a substantial change. He had told Harold the $15 test would get him almost nothing. He sat with this knowledge for 2 months before the January meeting. He did not seek Harold out during those 2 months. He was not the kind of man who sought out the people who had proved him wrong. He was the kind of man who processed these things internally, who revised his understanding quietly and without announcement and went forward on the revised understanding without making a ceremony of the revision. But he was also honest enough to know that what he had said to Harold in the supply store had been said publicly, in front of Dale Richter who had heard everything, and that the public nature of it created an obligation that the private processing did not discharge. He sat with this for 2 months. The Lancaster County Corn and Soybean Producers Association met on the second Thursday of January 2007 at the Agricultural Center in Lincoln. Harold had called the program coordinator in December and asked for 15 minutes on the agenda. She had said yes. Word had moved, as it always moved in the county, and more people than usual were present at the January meeting. The room held approximately 60 farmers, which was 15 or 20 more than a typical January attendance. Martin Cole was in the second row. Harold stood at the front of the room with Eleanor's calculation on a single sheet of paper and told the story without embellishment. He described the 31 years of following the extension liming recommendation without testing. The 3-year yield decline. The conversation with Harlan Webb and the recommendation for a comprehensive analysis. Martin Cole's comment at the supply store about the $15 test. His decision to try the basic test first. Eleanor's suggestion about the county lab service. 14 samples at $15 each. He described the results specifically, the 9 elevated pH locations, the 6 above 7.5, the correspondence with the yield suppression areas. The correction, sulfur applications, 3 years of recovery, the 2006 yield of 168 bushels per acre on ground that had been yielding 138. Then he put Eleanor's calculation on the board. We lost approximately $259,000 over 30 years because we weren't testing regularly, he said. The testing that would have prevented it would have cost approximately $1,200 over the same period. The room was quiet. I'm not here to say the Extension Service gave wrong advice, Harold said. The liming recommendation is appropriate for the buffering capacity it assumes. But the recommendation is a general guideline for a general situation. Your farm is a specific situation. If your specific situation is different from the general situation the recommendation assumes, you need to know that. He paused. And you can't know that without testing. He held up the sheet from the county lab. This is what told me. 14 samples. $15 each. $210 total. He looked at Martin Cole. Not in accusation, Harold was not an accusatory man, but directly, the way a person looks at someone when they are saying something that is relevant to that specific person. I was told, Harold said, that a $15 soil test would get me almost nothing. He set the sheet down on the table and sat down. The room was quiet for a moment longer than it usually was after presentations. Then Martin Cole stood up. This was not what Harold had expected. He had expected silence or questions from others. He had not expected Martin Cole to stand up. I said that, Martin said. He said it clearly, into the room. Not as a defense, as an acknowledgement. I told Harold, when he mentioned the basic soil test, that it would tell him almost nothing. I was wrong. He paused. I was comparing it to the comprehensive analysis I use on my operation, which is appropriate for 1-800 acres with variable rate equipment. Harold was asking a different question. The $15 test was appropriate for Harold's question. He looked at Harold. I should have asked what question you were trying to answer before I told you the tool was wrong. Harold looked at him. The advice wasn't wrong for your situation, he said. It was wrong for mine. The advice was offered before I knew your situation, Martin said. That's the error. He sat down. Harlan Webb, who was in the room in his professional capacity and who had been sitting quietly in the fourth row, said, Mr. Cole and Mr. Finch have both identified something important. The comprehensive precision analysis has significant value in the right context. But it's not the only tool, and it's not always the appropriate first tool. The basic pH test Mr. Finch used is a legitimate diagnostic instrument for specific, targeted questions. I should have helped Mr. Finch identify his specific question before recommending the comprehensive analysis. He looked at Harold. What Mr. Finch found on his farm, and what his wife calculated, is not unusual. Many operations in this county are following general management guidelines that may or may not be appropriate for their specific soil conditions. Regular basic testing is how you know whether the general guideline fits your specific situation. The discussion that followed ran for 45 minutes. Farmers asked about the basic testing service, the procedure, the cost, the lead time, what results you got and what you didn't. Harold answered what he could and deferred to Harlan on the technical details. Martin Cole answered two questions with a directness and specificity that suggested he had been thinking about the subject more carefully than anyone in the room had realized. After the meeting, walking to the parking lot in the January cold, Martin Cole fell into step beside Harold. $259,000, Martin said. That's what Eleanor calculated, Harold said. Your wife runs the books? She runs the books and she does the calculations, Harold said. She's better at both than I am. Martin Cole was quiet for a moment. They walked to the edge of the parking lot. I've been on the same liming schedule you were on, he said. For my upland acres. Harold looked at him. I've never tested, Martin said. I use the precision grid for nutrient management and variable rate application, but I've never specifically tested the pH on the lighter ground. A pause. My comprehensive analysis includes pH, but it's calibrated to average conditions, and the last full analysis I did was 2 years ago. That's not a long time, Harold said. No, Martin said. But I've been liming the ground for 22 years. He looked at the parking lot. I'm going to take some samples in the spring. Basic pH test, Harold said. Find out what you're dealing with before you decide what kind of analysis you need. Martin Cole nodded. Find out what question you're asking, he said. Before you decide what tool to use, Harold said. They shook hands in the January cold and drove their separate ways. Curtis Pryor called Harold the week after the January meeting. I've been farming for 44 years, Curtis said. I have never done a soil test. I follow the extension recommendations. My yields are normal for the county. I've never felt the need. Harold was quiet for a moment. Your yields are normal for the county, he said. Are they normal for your specific fields? I don't know what normal for my specific fields would look like, Curtis said. That's the point. I've been comparing to the county average, not to what my land is capable of. That's a different kind of question, Harold said. I want a test, Curtis said. Not the comprehensive thing, I don't need that. Basic pH, maybe the full nutrient panel. Tell me if I have a problem. Call the county lab, Harold said. $15 per sample for pH. They have expanded panels too, about $35, that include the major nutrients. You decide how many samples. How many did you take? 14, Harold said. One for each distinct area I had a question about. If you don't have a specific question about a specific area, you don't need a sample for it. That's sensible, Curtis said. It's what my wife told me, Harold said. Curtis Pryor took 12 soil samples from his 800-acre farm in March 2007. The results showed that 11 of the 12 samples were in the normal range. One sample, from a 40-acre area on the south end of his largest field, showed elevated pH consistent with overliming. Curtis called Harold when he got the results. South 40, he said. pH 7. 6. Stop liming it, Harold said. Apply sulfur at, he gave the rate, and test again in 2 years. What's my yield loss on 40 acres at 10%? Curtis said. About $1,700 a year, at current prices, Harold said. For how long? 20 years of liming that ground, Curtis said. He was quiet for a moment. $34,000. Probably. Plus the lime you didn't need, Harold said. Plus the lime, Curtis said. $180 in soil tests. 12 samples at $15. Yes, Harold said. $180, Curtis said, to himself as much as to Harold. Martin Cole took soil samples from his light upland acres in April 2007, as he had said he would in the parking lot after the January meeting. He took 19 samples, more than Harold had taken, because his operation was larger, and sent them to the county lab, paying $15 each. He called Harold in May when the results came back. 14 of 19 samples above 7. 0, he said. 8 above 7. 5. Harold was quiet. My best acres, Martin said. The ground I thought was my best ground. The same pattern you had. How long have you been liming that ground? 22 years on the original parcel. 15 years on the expansion I bought in 1992. When did your precision analysis last show those areas? 2 years ago, Martin said. The comprehensive grid showed adequate pH across the farm, but the grid was calibrated to the heavier soil types, and the averaging smoothed over the light soil variation. He paused. The precision analysis didn't catch what your $15 test caught. Harold thought about this. It was an important point, not that the comprehensive analysis was worse than the basic test, but that the comprehensive analysis had been designed and applied in a way that averaged over the specific variation that mattered. What are your upland yields? Harold asked. I've been running 157, 162, 160 on those acres, Martin said. I thought that was just normal variability. If your pH is 7. 5 to 7. 9, you're probably losing 10 to 15%, Harold said. Your potential on that ground could be 175 to 185. Martin Cole was quiet for a long time. I told you a $15 test would get you almost nothing, he said. You did, Harold said. I've been losing money on a third of my operation for at least 15 years, Martin said. And I had an $8,000 comprehensive analysis that didn't catch it, because I didn't ask it the right question. The comprehensive analysis is a good tool, Harold said. For the questions it's designed to answer. The question I needed to ask was simpler, Martin said. I just didn't know to ask it. Neither did I, Harold said. For 30 years. Martin Cole applied elemental sulfur to his affected upland areas in August 2007 and established a regular basic pH testing protocol for those soils on a 4-year cycle. He changed his variable rate lime prescription to 0 for the affected areas and significantly reduced it for the adjacent areas. He called Harold in November 2008 to report his first post-correction yield data. 168 on the affected ground, he said. Same as mine, Harold said. Same as yours, Martin said. In the spring of 2007, Harlan Webb revised the soil health management recommendations that the Lancaster County Extension Office provided to farmers. The revision was not a repudiation of the existing recommendations. The liming guidelines were sound and the precision grid sampling program was valuable for operations that needed it. What Harlan added was what had not been explicit in the previous version, a clear statement that the liming guidelines were general guidelines calibrated to average soil conditions, and that farmers with soils that varied from the average, particularly in buffering capacity, should verify through regular testing that the guidelines were appropriate for their specific fields. He also added a soil testing protocol that was not the precision grid program. Collect representative samples from each distinct area of the farm, test for pH and buffer pH at minimum, repeat every 3 to 4 years. Cost for a typical farm, $90 to $150 per testing cycle. He sent a copy of the revised recommendations to Harold Finch with a note. The changes in the attached reflect what I learned from our conversations and from your presentation at the January meeting. Thank you for bringing your experience to the group. H. Webb. Harold read the note and the revised recommendations and showed them to Eleanor. He listened, Eleanor said. He did, Harold said. Good scientists do, Eleanor said. When they're given evidence they didn't have before. Harold looked at the revised protocol, the basic pH testing schedule, the guidance on when the basic test was sufficient and when the comprehensive analysis was warranted. He also added a section on how to figure out what question you're asking, Harold said. Eleanor looked at the section Harold was indicating. It read, before selecting a soil testing program, identify the specific question you need to answer. Different questions require different levels of analysis. A farmer concerned about whether a long-term liming program has elevated pH on variable buffering capacity soils may find a basic pH test sufficient for initial diagnosis. A farmer implementing variable rate nutrient management on a precision agriculture platform requires comprehensive grid sampling. Selecting the right test requires knowing the question. That's from your January presentation, Eleanor said. That's from this kitchen table, Harold said. Eleanor looked at him. You're the data, she said. I'm the data, Harold agreed. The upland areas on Harold Finch's farm reached their full yield potential in 2006 and maintained it in the years that followed. Harold kept testing. He established a 4-year cycle and hired a local agricultural lab to do the work rather than collecting samples himself. The testing cost approximately $300 per cycle, $75 per year, approximately $0.16 per acre per year on his 480-acre farm. He stopped liming the upland areas entirely. He continued liming the bottomland areas, where the pH remained in the appropriate range, at a reduced rate that reflected what the testing showed those soils actually needed. The cumulative liming cost on his farm dropped by approximately 40% from the years of the blanket program. The yield on the upland areas increased by approximately 15% from the nadir of the problem years. He had more money and better yields, and he knew why both were true. Curtis Pryor established a 4-year testing cycle on his 800-acre farm. 3 other farmers who had been at the January 2007 meeting called Harold in the spring to ask about the basic testing service. Martin Cole sent a letter to the Lancaster County Farm Bureau describing his own experience with the overliming issue and recommending that farmers with light upland soils consider basic pH testing before assuming the general liming guidelines applied to their specific ground. Harlan Webb told Harold, in a conversation at the Agricultural Center the following year, that requests for the basic soil pH testing service had increased 40% from the prior year baseline. The January meeting, Harlan said. And Martin Cole's letter. Those two things moved the needle. Harold did not take particular satisfaction in these numbers.
See, Harold,
he was not a man
dry.
who took satisfaction
the
in
wheat
being
won't
right
grow.
in public.
What
He
do
took
now?
satisfaction in
We'll
was
find
the
a way,
simpler
son.
and more
We
private
always
thing.
do.
His fields were producing what they were capable of producing. In the spring of 2008, Martin Cole sat at his own kitchen table, not with his wife, who was in Omaha visiting family, but alone, and did his own version of Eleanor Finch's calculation. He had the yield records. He had the lime application records. He had the comprehensive analysis from 2005 that had not caught the overliming on his light upland ground. He had the basic pH test results from April 2007 that had caught it in a day, for $285. His calculation was rougher than Eleanor's, because his record keeping was less systematic, and because Martin Cole was an operator rather than an accountant and had always been more comfortable with the forward-looking numbers than the backward-looking ones. But he got to a figure. Approximately $340. Over 22 years of his original parcel and 15 years of the expansion. Unnecessary lime plus yield suppression, waited for his larger acreage. He sat with this number for a long time. Then he called Harold. I did my version of your wife's calculation, he said. What did you find? Harold asked. Martin told him. That's more than mine, Harold said. I have more acreage, Martin said. And I had the comprehensive analysis that told me what I thought was everything, so I had more confidence that I knew what was going on. Which meant I didn't go looking for what I didn't know. He paused. Confidence is expensive when it's misplaced. I didn't have your confidence, Harold said. I just had inertia. Same result, different route, Martin said. They were quiet for a moment. I'm going to present this at the fall meeting, Martin said, my version of what happened. The comprehensive analysis that missed the issue, the $15 test that caught it, the calculation. If it helps somebody, it's worth saying. It will help somebody, Harold said. Harold, Martin said. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. At the January meeting. When you described what I said at the supply store. You looked at me when you said it. Yes, Harold said. You weren't attacking me. No, Harold said. I was telling the truth about what happened. You were part of what happened. I know, Martin said. And I stood up. And I said what I should have said. He paused. I've been thinking about why I said what I originally said. In the supply store. Tell me, Harold said. I had just spent $8,000 on a comprehensive analysis that I believed was the right tool for everyone, Martin said. When you mentioned the $15 test, I think I heard it as criticism of what I had done, rather than as a different approach for a different question. He paused. I was defensive. Not about you, about my own decision. You didn't know my situation, Harold said. No, Martin said. But I also didn't ask. Neither did Harlan Webb, Harold said. Neither did I, for 30 years. All of us asking the wrong question, Martin said. Or not asking at all. Yes, Harold said. That's it exactly. Harold and Eleanor Finch had 2 children. Their daughter Patricia had become a teacher in Omaha. Their son Daniel was 38 years old in 2009 and had been working alongside Harold on the farm since graduating from agricultural college in 1994. He was a careful farmer with a systematic mind and a genuine interest in the biological complexity of agricultural systems, the kind of interest that made him read the technical literature and subscribe to 2 agronomic journals and correspond occasionally with researchers at the university. He had been present for the entire overliming episode, had been 32 when Harold made the first basic soil test, had helped apply the sulfur, had watched the yields recover year by year. He had not offered opinions during the process, because he understood that his father was working through something that was Harold's to work through. But he had been paying attention. And in the spring of 2009, working alongside Harold in the machine shed, he said, I've been thinking about the soil testing story. What about it? Harold said. The thing that strikes me is not the cost comparison, Daniel said. It's what the 31 years of watching your fields actually gave you. You knew the upland areas were underperforming. You knew the growth was different. You just didn't have a mechanism for the observation. That's right, Harold said. So the test didn't give you new information, exactly. It gave you an explanation for observations you already had. More or less, Harold said, which means the 31 years of watching wasn't wasted, Daniel said. It produced the observations that, once the test gave you the mechanism, made the whole picture make sense. He put down the grease gun. The knowledge and the test aren't alternatives to each other. They work together. Without the knowledge, you don't know where to point the test. Without the test, the knowledge doesn't have a mechanism to work with. Harold looked at his son. That's well put, he said. I've had 6 years to think about it, Daniel said. What are you going to do with it? Harold asked. Daniel looked at the fields visible through the open shed door, the spring fields, the soil just becoming workable in the March light. I want to set up a complete soil health monitoring program, he said. Not the full precision grid, I don't think we need that complexity yet. But more than we're doing. Regular pH testing, yes, but also organic matter, biological activity, compaction. A full soil health picture. Every 4 years, systematically. What will it cost? Harold asked. About $600 per testing cycle, Daniel said. $150 a year. Harold thought about Eleanor's calculation. $259, over 30 years of not testing. $150 per year for adequate testing. Set it up, Harold said. Daniel Finch set up the soil health monitoring program in the fall of 2009 and ran the first complete cycle in the spring of 2010. The results told him things about the farm that Harold's 37 years of watching had not revealed, not because the watching was wrong but because some things could not be seen, only measured. The monitoring program became a permanent feature of the Finch Farm's management. In the first 10 years of the program, it identified 3 management issues before they became yield problems. Daniel estimated the cost of those issues, had they developed fully, at approximately $180. The cost of the testing that caught them early, $1.500. Harold was retired by the time the last of those calculations was clear. He heard about them from Daniel and thought about Eleanor's kitchen table calculation in 2006 and about the particular arithmetic of attention, that paying attention was cheap and not paying attention was expensive, and the difference between the two was enormous over a farming lifetime. Harold Finch retired from active farming in 2012, at the age of 70, and moved with Eleanor to a smaller house on the north end of the property. He still walked the fields in April. He still had opinions about the growth and the soil condition and the decisions Daniel was making. He kept most of the opinions to himself, because it was Daniel's farm to manage now, and the opinions he shared were received better for being few. Eleanor retired from the record keeping in the same year, handing the ledgers to Daniel's wife Karen, who had been helping with them for 3 years and was ready to take them over fully. Before she handed them over, Eleanor made one addition to the filing system, a manila folder labeled soil testing record that contained the original results from 2003, The retest results from 2004, 2005, and 2006, the results from each subsequent testing cycle, and, at the front of the folder, a single sheet of paper with her 2006 calculation on it. At the bottom of that sheet, she had written a note in her precise handwriting. $1, 260 in tests over 30 years would have prevented $259,000 in losses. Keep testing. Karen read the note when she first opened the folder and called Eleanor to ask about it. Eleanor explained the full story, the 30 years of liming without testing, the $15 test, the calculation, what Harold had done with the information. He presented this at a county meeting? Karen asked. January 2007, Eleanor said. Martin Cole stood up and apologized in front of 60 farmers. Karen was quiet for a moment. I've never met a farmer who apologized at a public meeting, she said. It took him something to do it, Eleanor said. He's a careful man. He had been careless once and he knew it and he said so publicly. She paused. Harold respected him for it. Harold respected the person who called his test almost nothing? Karen asked. Harold respected the person who was wrong publicly and then said so publicly, Eleanor said. That's harder than being right. Martin Cole's presentation at the fall 2007 Lancaster County Corn and Soybean Producers Association meeting was attended by 84 people, the largest meeting attendance in the association's recent history. He stood at the front of the room with his own version of Eleanor's calculation and told his own version of the story. He was direct about what he had said to Harold at the supply store in 2003 and about why he had been wrong. He described his own overliming problem, the $285 in basic pH testing that had identified it, the calculation of what he had lost over 22 years. He was also direct about the comprehensive precision agriculture analysis he had done in 2005 and why it had missed the overliming issue. Not because the analysis was bad, it was a good analysis for the questions it was designed to answer, but because he had applied it without first asking whether it was the right tool for the specific questions about his light upland soils. Harold Finch told me at the January meeting that the recommendation is calibrated to a general situation and your farm is a specific situation, Martin said. He was right. I was following general guidelines with confidence, and confidence in the general guidelines prevented me from asking whether the general guidelines applied to my specific situation. He looked at the room. The question to ask before you spend money on analysis is, what am I actually trying to find out? Not what does the most comprehensive analysis look like? What am I trying to find out? He held up the county lab report. This answered my question for $285, he said. I had been paying $3,200 for a comprehensive analysis that didn't ask the same question. After the meeting, a younger farmer named Tyler Greer, 28 years old, farming his family's 240 acres for the first time on his own, came up to Martin and asked, "How do I know what question I'm asking?" Martin looked at him for a moment. "Walk your fields," he said. "Pay attention to what's different about different areas. When you see something you can't explain, yields that don't match what you'd expect, growth that's inconsistent, soil that behaves differently than the surrounding ground, that's your question. The test is the answer." Tyler Greer went home and walked his fields the following weekend and found an area he had never been able to explain, a 20-acre patch on the east end of the home farm where the soybeans always established more slowly than the rest of the field. He took 4 samples. 3 came back normal. 1 showed elevated pH at 7.4. He called Martin Cole when he got the results. 20 acres, he said. pH 7.4. Your father never tested this ground? Martin asked. My father never tested anything, Tyler said. Same as mine, Martin said. Same as Harold Finch. Same as a lot of us. He paused. The difference is you found it at 28 instead of 61. $60 in tests, Tyler Greer said. $60 in tests, Martin confirmed. Now you know what you're dealing with. Harold Finch walked the fields in April 2015, as he had walked them every April for 43 years, though now it was a shorter walk. His hips were not what they had been, and he made one circuit of the near fields rather than the full tour of the property. He was 73 years old and the southeast corner of the upland area was not far from the house, and he walked there in the April morning because it was where the most dramatic part of the story had happened, the corner that had tested at pH 7.9 in 2003. The worst affected area of the overliming problem, the ground that had yielded 138 bushels per acre in the worst years and 168 in the recovery years and that had been testing at 6.6 in Daniel's most recent cycle. The early season corn growth in that corner was as good as anywhere on the farm. Even, uniform, the green of health rather than the pale struggling green he had been watching for 3 years before 2003. He stood in the southeast corner of the upland area and thought about the things that had happened over the 43 years he had farmed this ground. He thought about Martin Cole standing up at the January 2007 meeting and saying I was wrong in front of 60 farmers. Martin had not been required to stand up. The presentation was about Harold's experience, and Harold had not named Martin except by the direct and impersonal description of what had been said at the supply store. Martin had identified himself, had claimed the comment as his, had corrected it publicly. That had taken something. He thought about Harlan Webb's revised recommendations and the sentence about identifying your question before selecting your test. The sentence Eleanor had said came from the kitchen table. The sentence was in the official Extension Service guidance now, used by every county in the Extension Service's regional network, in the standard soil testing protocol distributed to farmers who called the office. He thought about Daniel's monitoring program and the 3 issues caught before they became problems and about the $180,000 in losses that $1,500 in testing had avoided. He thought about Tyler Greer's $60 test and the 20 acres at pH 7. 4 found at 28 instead of 61, and about all the years of loss Tyler would not have because he had asked the question early enough. He thought about his father's orientation, the disposition toward knowing your specific ground, taking general recommendations as starting points rather than conclusions, testing the match between the general and the specific on a regular basis. His father had understood this. He had transmitted it to Harold in the imperfect way that practical knowledge transmits, not as a system, not as a methodology, but as a habit of mind. Know your fields. Know your soil. Test the match between what the recommendation assumes and what you actually have. Harold had known this, in the way you know things your father told you. He had not applied it, for 30 years. The $15 test had applied it for him. The test had connected the general recommendation to the specific ground and shown, finally and precisely, what the match looked like. He walked back to the house in the April morning, past the fields that were doing what they were supposed to do. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he came in. How do they look? She asked. Good, he said. Even in green. Daniel is planning to do the full monitoring cycle this fall, she said. I know, Harold said. He told me. Karen updated the soil testing folder, Eleanor said. She added the 2014 results. Everything in range. Harold poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had looked at the $15 test results in May 2003, where Eleanor had done the calculation in December 2006, where he had decided to take the story to the January meeting. He thought about the number at the top of Eleanor's calculation, $259,000. He thought about the number at the bottom, $1,260. He thought about the ratio between them and about what the ratio meant. The ratio meant, attention is cheap and inattention is expensive, and the arithmetic of the difference is enormous over a farming lifetime, and the way to be attentive is not to spend more money on more comprehensive analysis but to ask the right question and find the right tool for that specific question, and the right tool is often simpler and cheaper than the most comprehensive tool available, and the most important step is not the tool but the question. His father had said something like this. Not in these words, his father had not been a man for abstractions. But in the specific, practical terms that farmers use, know what you're asking before you spend money on asking it. Harold had known this. He had not asked for 30 years. He would not make that particular error again. He had made it once and it had cost him $259,000, and he had told 60 people about it at a county meeting and it had changed the way soil testing was talked about in Lancaster County for the decade following. The account was settled. The ground was healthy. The knowledge was in the record. His son was farming it. The agricultural chemistry described in this novel, soil pH, liming, overliming, micronutrient availability, and pH correction with elemental sulfur, is real. The mechanisms are accurate. Overliming is a documented problem in agricultural settings, particularly on lighter soils with lower buffering capacity that are managed according to recommendations calibrated for heavier soils. The basic soil testing service at $15 per sample reflects the approximate cost of basic pH testing at university agricultural laboratory services across the Midwest. Costs vary by institution and by the scope of the analysis. The relationship between general agricultural guidelines and field-specific conditions, and the importance of regular soil testing to calibrate general recommendations to specific situations, is real and is a recognized topic in agricultural extension education. Harold Finch, Eleanor Finch, Daniel Finch, Harlan Webb, Martin Cole, Curtis Pryor, and Tyler Greer are fictional. Lancaster County, Nebraska is real. Eleanor's calculation is fictional. The arithmetic it represents is not.